Hi, everyone. I'm Radhika Desai, and welcome to another of the International Manifesto Group discussions. Ariela Ruiz Caro is going to give us a talk. The title is Presidential Elections in Peru, the Struggle Between Two Economic Models in the Light of Social Protest in Chile and Colombia. Ariela is an economist from Humboldt University of Berlin, and she holds also a master's degree in economic integration processes from the University of Buenos Aires. She's had an extremely interesting career in sort of institutions of international economic governance, where she has worked as a consultant on trade, integration, and natural resources at the Economic Commission of Latin America, or ECLAC. Also in several other institutions, such as the Latin American Economic System, or SELA, the Institute for the Integration of Latin America and the Caribbean, or INTAL, and also in the Andean Community, and the Commission for the Permanent Representatives of MERCOSUR. And she has worked as the Economic Attaché at the Peruvian Embassy in Argentina. She's at the moment an analyst in the Americas program for the Andean Southern Cone region, and a columnist for the newspaper La República, and a member of the advisory council of the Peruvian Forum for International Relations. So, Ariela, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Radhika. I'm going to, good morning to everybody. For us, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and good afternoon. Any case. So I'm going to start. On June 6, Peruvians will have to elect in a second round the president who will govern the country for the next 5 years. The candidates are Pedro Castillo, who represents the Peru Liberty Party, it's in English, and Keiko Fujimori from the Fuerza Popular Party. Pedro Castillo was invited to be the Peru Libre's presidential candidate because its general secretary, Vladimir Cerrón, a doctor graduated in Cuba, designed a programmatic ideology that considers that foreign investment should not have the same treatment as national ones, that the profits obtained by transnationals must be invested in Peru, that contracts with transnational companies must be renegotiated so that they pay more taxes. If agreements are not reached, the nationalization can proceed, especially in the mining, gas, oil, hydroenergy, and communication sectors. Keiko Fujimori is the political heiress of her father, Alberto Fujimori, who ruled the country between 19,000 and 2001. He, the father, is actually in prison convicted of corruption and crimes against humanity. Keiko Fujimori's party, Fuerza Popular, represents the continuity of the neoliberal model established by her father in 1990. She is accused by the prosecutor's office to 30 years in prison for leading a criminal organization for money laundering. Her closest environment is also charged with different sanctions for the same causes. If she does not win the presidency, she will end up in jail. As a background, it is important to say that Peru has been under neoliberal governments for 30 years. Alberto Fujimori was the president who established neoliberal principles in the early 90s and turned the state into a tiny entity. These neoliberal principles were incorporated in the 1993 Constitution that was promulgated in the midst of the dictatorship imposed by Alberto Fujimori, who gave a self-coup in 1992. This self-coup was supported by an important part of the citizens, as it was considered that a strong hand was required to end with a terrorism imposed by the shining path in Peru. The former president has not only got rid of public companies, but also, Fujimori no? But also favored the expansion of the private sector in the health and education sectors and turned them into an attractive business while reducing public spending on these services. Thus, he created first world health and education for a few and precarious systems for the vast majority of the population. Behind the balance of the macroeconomic accounts, social spending was the adjustment variable that led to insufficient levels of internet connection in rural areas and poor educational levels. Informality, one of the highest in the region in Latin America, was the way that 70% of workers found to survive in a society that has marginalized the majority. The pandemic has resulted in 80% of the population living in informality. After Venezuela, Peru was the country that registered the largest economic decline in Latin America, almost 12%. After Fujimori's government, all the presidents have maintained the model. There was only one who attempted to turn to the left in 2011. It was the one chaired by President Ollanta Humala, who had the support of the best technical cadres on the left. But a few months after taking power, he was co-opted by the economic power and fired them all. That said, I return to the subject of the second round of the elections that will be held in just 1 week. The first round was held on April 11 and had an unusual characteristics because the citizens chose the most feared candidate, Pedro Castillo, and the most rejected and anti-popular candidate, Keiko Fujimori, to compete in the second round. But this has not been the only peculiarity of this choice. The level of absenteeism and white and float votes totaled almost 11 million, the highest in the last 5 elections. The fragmentation of the vote due to the presence of 18 political parties determined that Pedro Castillo received only 2.7 million votes, 11% of the electoral roll, while Keiko Fujimori obtained less than 2 million votes, 7.6% of the electoral roll. In other words, 81% of Peruvians of voting age did not vote for any of them. These events denote the crisis of representativeness of the political parties, a phenomenon that takes in everywhere, and it's similar to that which has occurred in Chile 2 weeks ago with the election of the 155 delegates to the Constituent Assembly who will draft a new constitution to replace the one promulgated during the dictatorship by General Augusto Pinochet in 1980. 52% of the delegates elected to make up the Constituent Assembly are independent. Both the concertation center-left parties and the right-wing alliance that ruled Chile since democracy was established in 1990 were defeated. In particular, the right wing only obtained 23% of the votes, which does not reach the third necessary to veto the contents of the new constitution. Among the organized parties, the alliance between the Communist Party and the Frente Amplio was strengthened. I refer to the Chilean case because the principles of the Chilean and Peruvian constitutions are very similar, especially in the economic chapter and in the subsidiary role of the state. In Peru, the left parties also demand the change of the constitution through a constituent assembly. Pedro Castillo generates mistrust for the radical left-wing positions of the party he represents, but above all, like Oscar was telling, for the propaganda and fear that is instilled in relation to his candidacy. By the other side, Keiko Fujimori carries the backpack of backpack of the dictatorship presided over by his father, plus that of his own authorship. During the last 5 years, he was the architect of the political instability that the country experienced. From parliament, where her party had an absolute majority, she organized the dissolution of several ministerial cabinets, led to the dissolution of Congress and the election of a new one. In this 5-year term of government, Peru had 4 presidents. Keiko Fujimori defends the sustainability of the model and has the support of economic and media power. The campaign against Pedro Castillo is fierce. Oscar will tell us about that. As part of their electoral strategy, they use the threat of communism. The campaign ignores that candidate Castillo is part of the peasant self-defense organizations that faced the Shining Path terrorist movement in the 80s. They also overlook the fact that between 2005 and 2017, Castillo was a member of a center-right party, Perú Posible. The triumph of Pedro Castillo in the first round was not expected by anyone. Until a week before the election, he was not among the favorites. On the left, Verónica Mendoza, candidate of the Juntos por el Perú party, a more structured and moderate leftist group, was among the 4 with the best chances to go to the second round. But the results of her election were poor. Instead, Pedro Castillo received the votes of the inhabitants of the interior of Peru, of the forgotten and displaced. The party led by Verónica Mendoza has endorsed Pedro Castillo. Both leaders intend to work together to build a new social pact through a popular constituent assembly that drafts a new constitution. They reject the economic chapter of the constitution, the role of the subsidiary role of the state in business activities. In other words, the participation of the state is allowed in our constitution now only in activities that are not profitable for private capital. This principle constitutes the core on which the country's economic growth model has been generated over the last 30 years. To dispel fears and mistrust, Castillo has made commitments to the public that he will leave his post in July 2026, as established by the Constitution, that he will respect property, etc., etc. But despite the anti-communist campaign directed against candidate Pedro Castillo, he has had more support than Keiko Fujimori. Until last Sunday, the polls gave him an advantage of between 5 and 10 percentage points. This advantage in favor of Pedro Castillo took place despite the fact that he's an improvised candidate who has the heavy burden of the members of the Peru Libre Party. In videos and audios revealed, the position of some of the elected congressmen of the party he represents is shown. They point out the following: if we take power, we will not give it up. We will be like Venezuela. Capitalism has already ruled for 200 years since we became independent from Spain. We will not respect this democratic nonsense, and we will stay in power. However, the polls published today show a technical tie between both candidates. This reflects the poor performance of the debate between the technical teams of both games that took place last Sunday, in which the members of Pedro Castillo's team showed a poor performance. But above all, they reflect the slaughter that was perpetrated in a small town in the region that concentrates 50% of the coca cultivation in Peru, where the state does not have a presence and where drug trafficking governs. In the attack, which occurred while the debate was taking place, 60 civilians were killed, including 2 children. Without further investigation, the Joint Command of the Armed Forces attributed the slaughter to the Shining Path Terrorist Command. They also reported having found flyers that said, "Whoever votes in favor of Keiko Fujimori is a traitor. She's a murderer of Peru. Never again Fujimori." For this reason, the judge of the small town where the attack occurred told the armed forces to investigate first before stating that the attack had been perpetrated by the Shining Path. Indeed, 3 days after the attack, the Defense Ministry reported that the armed action corresponded to narco-terrorists led by the military command of the so-called militarized Communist Party of Peru, a fraction that broke with the Shining Path when the peace agreement was signed in 1993. I don't want this is a great story, but when Shining Path was the abbreviated name of the Communist Party of Peru, Shining Path, which began armed struggle in July 1980 on the eve of a presidential election. The goal of the Shining Path was to replace the Peruvian institution, which they consider bourgeois, with a revolutionary communist peasant regime, which takes into account the Maoist concept of new democracy. This group was captured. This group has been one of the most violent armed groups in the history of the 20th century in Latin America. If one looks, for example, at the intensity of the fighting or the number of violent deaths during the 12 years in which it operated. His performance generated an internal war that left 32,000 deaths. So I will, I think the time is finishing, but it's important to say that the economy and social situation is extremely serious. Any stage is uncertain. The social protests of Chile and Colombia are observed in Peru. Last November, mass demonstrations in Peru led to the departure in a week of a government and the appointment of the current president of Peru, Francisco Sagasti. In Chile, social protests began in October 2009, which took 36 lives, and led to an agreement to form a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. On the other hand, Colombia, the second country with the highest inequality in Latin America and with a monetary poverty of 42%, is mired in social demonstrations throughout the country that have caused almost 60 deaths in just 1 month. When the elections are 1 year away, the candidate Gustavo Petro of the leftist party Colombia Dignidad is the one with the best chance of winning the elections. And in Chile, the candidates of the alliance of the Communist Party and the Frente Amplio have good chances as well in the presidential elections that will be held in November. What the social protest, both in Colombia and Chile, as well as the electoral struggle in Peru show, is that the neoliberal economic model has reached its limit and changes are required. So I will stay here because time is off, and maybe we can discuss. And also, Oscar has many things to say because he has a big experience in analysis and economic analysis about Peru. Thank you very much.
Great, Ariela. Thank you so much. So now, as previously advertised. Both Ariela and Oscar Ugarteche, who, for those of you who don't know, is essentially at the Institute for Economic Investigation at the University, National Autonomous University of Mexico. So he will also help, and he's by origin Peruvian, I believe, and takes a lot of interest in Peruvian affairs. So these two wonderful people are going to answer all sorts of questions. So please fire away. Okay, maybe I will start with a question. So for me, it really involves, so can you, both of you, say a little bit more about the connection between the Sendero Luminoso, which was, as you say, very violent, etc. So, I mean, from the context, from the perspective of today and the unrest that is taking place, how do you understand the role that that movement played in politics? And are there any connections between the present left-wing forces and that movement?
If I may, Sendero is the Khmer Rouge of Latin America. Okay, it has the same ideology, and it operated in the same way. It was very murderous, and it didn't kill the bourgeois. They were stating they were attacking. They killed basically peasants and left-wing leaders. So, I mean, a complicated crowd. Now, Sendero has become a myth. If you're associated to anything that resembles a progressive thinking for the right that has radicalized since the 1990s, the right wing in Peru went into what in Europe is now called the alt-right. It went beyond the conservative right. It's the neoliberal, it's the Hayekian right. It's all the way to the right. It is a right that believes that if the state has any role, then it's communism. That's how extreme this is. So public education, no, you have to have private education. There are no such things as public goods in that view. And terrorism is then associated to a view where there are public goods. Anything that has to do with free education, better health, and so on is immediately associated to Sendero Luminoso and violence. So it's become a caricature.
Yes.
It's an esquisse on the right and on the left. It's totally it's become integrist, is that right? They're integrist movements. I mean, the right has become an essentialist right, which can make it a very violent right.
Yes.
And the left, there is Castillo, who won the election, the people behind Castillo who are fed up with an economic model that has given Peru basically a doubling of GDP. GDP in Peru doubled. But the living conditions for most of the population have not changed. The beach houses in the south of Lima have changed. Lots, the 100 kilometers of very large, nice beach houses for about 100,000 people. And the other 32,900,000 have received nothing or very little. And that's the problem. That's the problem. It's the old 1% problem. It's a very highly concentrated economic growth.
Yeah.
And that's the scenario, basically.
Ariela, you wanted to add something.
Yes, Radhika. I wanted to say, Sendero Luminoso started his army actions in 1980. In 1992, Abimael Guzman, the leader of this movement, was captured. It was the intelligence. It was not Fujimori, as everybody says. it was a group of intelligence group of the police. They worked behind the back of Fujimori, and they made intelligence, and they captured the whole environment, the people, the dirigents,
The leaders.
the leaders, yeah,
Leaders.
the leaders. So in 1993, Abimael Guzman signed a peace agreement with Fujimori, and then there was a division in the movement. The ones who agreed with the peace, with a peace, and they created a movement in 2009. It's called Movement for Amnesty and Fundamental Rights, Movadef. The other one were the dissidents. They didn't agree with the peace. So they formed in 1999 a so-called militarized Communist Party of Peru, which ended up becoming guardians of drug trafficking in the most important coca producing area of the country. So this part of Sendero Luminoso is the one who is the author of the attacks last week. But this is not Sendero Luminoso of Abimael Guzman. This was a dissident, a part of Shining Path. But the part that agreed with the peace, Movadef, that movement, they want to participate in elections because how can we, yeah, we agree with peace. We were wrong. We don't want more war. We agree with the peace. But how can we participate in politics? We want to participate in elections. And there are 5 of these movements that are on the list that are elected congresses. And that's the reason, because the right people say there are terrorists. Pedro Castillo is terrorist because he has terrorists in his, there are congressmen in the parliament that are from Sendero Luminoso. But we have to know the story because they agreed with the peace, with peace. So they want to participate in politics. They are not authorized to participate in politics, but they participate in another parties as invited people. Right. Right. So that I wanted to make a precision of what is happening. Yes. But the right media confuse the people. It's not the same. They are not anymore terrorists, and they are not. Maybe some work with the narco traffic, but because narco traffic in Peru goes through all social statements, politics, armed forces, everybody. For us, this is the main problem. I think Peru is a narco state, narco estado. And that's a problem. We have similar problems as Colombia. This is in the constitution, the economic chapter, we are similar to Chile. But in this narcotraffic, the governor of narcotraffic and narcoterrorismo, we are the same as Colombia. This is a very big problem. Thank you.
I have Keith, and then I certainly have lots of questions, and just let me know if anyone else has questions. Keith and then John. Please go ahead, Keith. You are still muted, Keith.
Hopefully, yeah, okay. Thanks. First of all, apologies for being late to the meeting. Despite it, or perhaps because of it being a holiday weekend in the UK, I seem to have ended up triple booked, but I think I heard most of the talk and it was really fascinating. So thanks very much for that. The couple of questions I have are as follows. Some years ago, leaving aside Sendero Luminoso, some years ago, most of the fairly large number of left-wing parties in Peru from various different traditions, as I recall, came together in some form of united front. And that was polling extremely high in the polls for a long time and appeared to be doing very well. But they seemed to then enjoy the same collapse of support as the other established parties in Peru, and I wondered, why that was, what happened, because then you had, until this present situation, which, as you explained and which I've read elsewhere, came as a bit of a surprise. You also had the Humala phenomenon in Peru, which is, as I understand it, a bit like what we saw in Ecuador on a couple of occasions. Before and after Korea, where people were elected on the left, but elected from the left, but governed from the right. So, what really happened with that block of left-wing forces, and how is the present situation different? And in relation to that, I'd like to ask, is the Communist Party of Peru, Patria Roja, playing a significant part in what's happening at the moment? And finally, I'd like to ask what's become of APRA and what role is it playing since the various scandals of their former president, Alan Garcia, and his suicide?
So those are a lot of substantial questions. So I'm going to ask Ariela and Oscar to reply to them before going to John.
Oscar, ¿tú quieres primero?
Okay, así una pintada. You're referring to Izquierda Unida, to the United Left. The United Left was united in the early 80s and managed to have several mayors elected, local governments elected during the 1980s, which was when the war against Sendero was growing. Sendero killed a lot of the leaders of the United Left throughout the country. The United Left, I think, more or less disappeared in 1992 with the coup d'etat. When Fujimori does his coup d'etat to do the economic and political reforms, I have the impression that was the end of Izquierda Unida. That was the end. It was falling apart since 1990, but by 92, it had more or less fallen apart. And in the 90s, the Fujimori period was a period of destruction of political parties on the right and on the left.
Syndicates, labor
and unions,
and
trade unions were destroyed. Industry was destroyed. The productive industry was destroyed. So the trade unions behind the productive industries were destroyed.
Social movements.
The social movements were destroyed. Those were very complicated. The Fujimori years were very complicated years. Very complicated years. And those were the years where the narco state was created. And the strong link between drug traffic and government was settled and defined. And what we have had after that has been some efforts to put the left together again, but the national feeling went to the right. The common sense changed sides. Common sense had been to the left, and then during the 90s, common sense went to the right. And now we have common sense again on the left. So, it's moved. It's moved.
Yeah.
And APRA, I don't know what, APRA is one of the leaders of the anti-communist speech in Peru now. But APRA was a leader of the anti-communist speech in the 1960s. So, I mean, they have been always very strong anti-communist and have had a very strong anti-communist stance and have named communists everywhere. I mean, they thought Belaunde was a communist. He was a moderate right-wing government, and he was accused of communism. So that's where that plays. And it doesn't exist anymore, I don't think.
I just want
it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, Ariela, both of you, maybe beginning with Oscar, can you just summarize briefly, if you were to ask somebody, what are the left forces behind Pedro Castillo? What would you say?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's the left forces behind Pedro Castillo. I have the impression it's poor people behind Pedro Castillo. Not necessarily organized left.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Ariela, go ahead.
Absolutely in accord with Oscar. There is no organized movement behind him. Only poor people, behind him. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I guess please feel free to return, Keith, if you feel that any part of your question was not answered, but I'll go to John next.
Yes, just picking up on what Oscar said regarding the destruction of trade unions and social movements in the 1990s. Could you project that, the two of you, into the present? That is, if there is a shift in opinion towards the left now, is this also reflected in the revival of social movements? That's it.
Yes. Yes, but the revival of the social movements is also on the peculiar side. Because looking at it at a distance, what we're having now in Peru looks a bit like what's happening in the West in general. You have a social movement that gets organized for something, for some issue. It addresses the issue. It brings out 500,000 people. And the next morning, there is nothing. That does not lead to a social organization. It leads to people joining together, banding together at one moment, somewhere, and they can do it very well and very fast. And technology helps a lot. But that does not mean they are weaving a relationship amongst themselves, and that relationship is beyond a single issue. They are all single issue social movements. There was one for the minimum wage in the countryside, and I was struck. They managed to do a strike. The workers in the countryside managed to convene students in the cities to go to where they were in the countryside and protest by sitting down in the highway, in the Pan American highway, thus stopping the traffic from north to south in the country. And that was hundreds of thousands. And it lasted, I don't know, 1 week. And then it disappeared. Nothing was left. So that's what I find strange. I mean, coming from a history of political parties, when you look at the social movements and you see they are not politicized in the proper sense of the word, then it becomes more difficult because they are all single issue social movements. And that's very complicated. And in Chile, those social movements who have the same characteristics are the ones that have gotten the Constitutional Assembly. But that's the reason why you have independents, 52% of the elected deputies in the Constituent Assembly are independent. They are not left, they are not anything, they are independent. And that I have the impression that's the case with Castillo. What he has behind him is a whole lot of independent people.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, okay. Carlos.
Thank you.
Does Ariela want to add anything?
No, I would only say the same thing happens now in Colombia, but and the same thing happened in Peru when we throw out a president in 1 week. That was not a social protest identified with a party. It was independence, and the same phenomenon happens in France, in Arab countries. There is a crisis of representation of political parties. They don't represent people anymore.
Correct.
That only that.
I think that's exactly, I would, that's what it sounds like to me. Carlos, please go ahead.
Thanks, Radhika, and thanks to both for the presentations. Very useful, very interesting. 2 quick questions. Firstly, of course, Marxism in Latin America to a significant degree begins in Peru with José Carlos Mariátegui. And I'm interested to find out to what extent Perú Libre and Pedro Castillo connect to that sort of intellectual and radical legacy of Latin American Marxism. And second question is, looking at the policies of Castillo, they're sort of come across as quite classically pink-tied Latin American policy set, with maybe some more concessions on the social side to social conservatism around gender issues and sex education and things of that nature. But one very important component of the original pink tide of 15, 20 years ago was a sort of orientation towards Latin American integration and strong coordination between the different countries of the left in Latin America, especially Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, Brazil. And I noticed that Castillo, under some pressure, had come out and said, aquí no hay chavismo. There's not going to be any chavismo here. We're not going to be too radical, and we're not going to be involved in this Latin American integrationalist plot type of politics. So, I'm interested to find out to what extent Castillo and Perú Libre share this orientation of the importance of working together with progressive forces across Latin America. Thanks.
Can I answer?
Please.
Okay. Mariátegui is important for the party that represents Pedro Castillo, but Pedro Castillo is not a member of Perú Libre's party. He's invited because the leader, the general secretary of the party cannot participate in elections because he has accusations of corruption, so he can't participate in elections. But the ideology of that party, they auto-defined themselves as Marxist, Leninists, Mariáteguistas, and izquierdistas, leftists. So Mariátegui is an important reference, but not only for them, for Sendero Luminoso too. Sendero Luminoso of Abimael Guzmán, the lemma is in English, the lemma was, we are going to walk over the path or through the path that Mariátegui showed us. So it was an example. From Abimael Guzmán, the first leader of Sendero Luminoso, to the party that Pedro Castillo represents, Mariátegui is very important. I think Pedro Castillo thinks integration and political coordination with Latin American countries is very important. He has trade ties with Evo Morales from Bolivia, and maybe with Argentina too. They are not, this was not publicly made, but of course, I know I lived 22 years in Argentina, and everybody asks me and hope that Pedro Castillo, although all the ¿cómo se dice? Defectos, carencias, Pedro Castillo is not a good candidate, but he's representing the poor people, and that's the important thing. So people must, I think people must push him, must be in this fight with him. Although there are members of Movadef, although there are things that are not good for the country, like some congressmen that have been elected and say, we are not going to leave the power, we want to be like Venezuela, and what I said before. So, but leaving this apart, I think people must stay with him. But now the polls today are say that they are tied, and this attack from Sendero Luminoso was very hard for the future of his candidatura. Oscar,
I think something I can add to this is that since 2011, every time Keiko Fujimori arrives at the second round at the ballotage, there is an incident where somebody from Sendero murders somebody else, and that comes out in the front page of the newspapers. This is the third time, in 2011 and 2016, and now in 2021. So that's clearly, that's built up, no? That's an intelligence operation.
That people will become afraid of left candidates.
That's right. That's right. And the other thing is that the motto of Down the Shining Path with Mariátegui, which is why the Shining Path is called Shining Path, because it's down along the shining path of Mariátegui. So anything that resembles progressivism of any sort is immediately associated with Sendero Luminoso, which is so wrong. It is so ridiculously wrong. But the other part that I find that is even more wrong is that there is the right, in this caricature it does, of the left, doesn't have any contemplation for how the left has changed and modified and sort of updated itself in some ways. Stalinism, which is essentially what they're talking about, doesn't exist. But the reference for this alt-right that we have in Peru is Stalinism, because that's black and white. Okay, it's either you're alt-right or you're a Stalinist. There's nothing in between, and all of the in-betweens are there. And the pink tide, seen from Peru, the pink tide is Stalinist. Can you imagine? That's how far to the right common sense has shifted. And that's the role of the media. That's the media, that's the newspapers, the radio, television. It's awful. It's awful. I mean, the role of the media in Peru is disastrous. Disastrous. And it resembles, what does it resemble? It resembles the Central America of the 1980s. That's what it looks like. When I see the newspapers in Peru, this looks like Guatemala 1982. No, if anybody had a pink mark in the forehead, that's a communist. Here you have the communist. And this little old lady is feeding children or something. I mean, it's, you know, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Great. I mean, I think we're really seeing a picture of a kind of a essentially breakdown of any serious political processes, which means that people's anger, dissatisfaction, etc., can only be expressed in inchoate fashion, you know, etc. I guess I have two questions, and then if there are no more, then we can wrap up this part. So my question really relates. Both of them relate to the pandemic situation. So I remember reading somewhere that part of the reason why Peru had such a bad pandemic was because basically, quite apart from being protected from the pandemic, people, particularly in the mining industry, were forced to go to work. Like they were not allowed to, you know, stay home, etc. Is that the case? And secondly, I guess, to what extent do you think that the manner in which the pandemic has played out has, how is that interacting with the long-term, essentially disintegration of politics in Peru today? And how does it tie in with this very low participation rate that you were talking about, Ariela, at the beginning of the talk, that, you know, hardly anybody is actually going to vote?
Right. Well, the thing with the pandemic, more than the mining industry, is that 70% of the population is not employed. 70. And that 70% of the population has to eat. So what happened was that, technically speaking, Peru locked down March the 2nd. And it locked down. People could not leave their houses. And here in Mexico, we were walking around the streets, and I was talking to my friends in Lima who saying we are locked in the house and we can't even go for a walk in the park. And we need to take some fresh air, and we can't go out even to take some fresh air. So that was the lockdown, but the lockdown was for the, quote, rich, those who could afford to lock down. So then what came after that was a bonus program to give money to the population so they didn't starve, which all was fine and dandy, except how do you give money to the population that doesn't have bank accounts? And that was extremely complicated. And that led to long queues. It led to checks being given to people with their DNA, with their identification card, with their voting card numbers. So they had the check, but then they had to go to the bank and they had to queue. And when they queued, then you had an increase in the death rates. And it was then discovered, lo and behold, that the medical system, the health system, had weakened after the 1990s because of this privatization thing. So instead of having more and better public health institutions around the country, we had private hospitals for the rich, and for the rest, either there was nothing or there was something that was very scarce, a tiny little medical post somewhere, no oxygen. At the beginning, no medicines. They had to change the budgetary rule to give the health sector a bigger budget to buy the vaccines and to buy the medicines, to provide the medicines free at the health centers. So Peru has seen, like Mexico, has seen the impact, well, and like Brazil, has seen the impact of this reduction of the state in health. And at the same time, the impact of having gotten rid of the industrial sector and the productive sector and having this massive informal sector that has to go out to work to do anything. The informal sector does anything, from selling bubblegum to window washing, whatever. And that's been the problem. That's been the problem. More than, it's right, the mining industry continued working, but as far as I know, the mining industry reduced the labor force by 2/3. So 1/3 continued working. And that had a funny effect. We have in Latin America an increase in international reserves. We continued exporting, but since economic dynamics were reduced, imports fell. So we have a massive trade surplus. And you have lots of dollars. And people are speaking about a debt crisis. What debt crisis? We don't have a debt crisis. We have a fiscal problem, not a debt crisis. But that's all a result of this informal sector on the one hand. And on the other hand, the mining industry continued working. And I have no idea what the record is of people dead in the mining sector. But what we do know is that most of the people who are dead come from the informal sector. But COVID has not been a poor person's virus only. I have the impression it's more democratic than that. It's killed people up and down. It's killed, for example, all of the theater directors. Out of 5 major theater directors in Peru, 4 have died, and 1 is coming out of a very complicated situation. Peirano is coming out of intensive care unit. So it's very democratic. It's killed everybody. Now, of course, the more money you have, the more you can afford to stay home. That's also true.
Yeah. Ariela, did you want to add anything?
Yes, Radhika. I would add only that in order to answer your question, that there are no many workers in the minery sector because it's minery is very low
intensive.
capital intensive, but
intensive.
not exactly. So it's not the main reason that we have so poor levels in this pandemic. I think that people die not from COVID, but not from having things like oxygen. It's what Oscar was telling. And the other question, the other thing that I wanted to say in relation with the theme of this morning is we wonder what are the chances that we will have a Marxist-Leninist government in Peru. There are no chances because Pedro Castillo does not have support in Congress. If he wins the election, he has only the support of 37 congressmen out of a total of 130. He has the reaction of economic power, media, and the armed forces. If elected, Keiko Fujimori will be in charge of organizing his departure from the president in the same way as she organized the dissolution of several ministerial cabinets and the departure of 3 presidents during the current term of government. As I said before, Keiko Fujimori is accused of corruption and the prosecution has requested a prison sentence of 30 years. As long as she isn't the president, if she wins, she will have immunity. But after her term, her destiny will be prison. One might then wonder who has the greatest interest in not leaving power. Yeah. That's the kind of democracy that we are speaking about. Pedro Castillo doesn't have any power. He will be forced to leave or he will leave. But Keiko Fujimori will make everything to stay. Yes. Yeah, that I wanted to add that.
No, I think that's a very climactic note to end on, I would say. And so I guess we will all be watching the second round very closely. Thanks to you, we will be considerably more informed than we would have otherwise been. So thank you very much.